Hardcore wrestling has long been one of the most attention-grabbing styles, as it involves taking things to another level of brutality altogether. So it should come as no surprise that many performers have chosen to specialize in this genre over the years then. But just who are the best hardcore wrestlers in history? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with Mick Foley. Yes, if you were to ask most wrestling fans the first name that came to mind when they thought about hardcore wrestling, it would likely be Mick Foley. And that's because during wrestling's biggest boom period at the turn of the millennium, he was the man known as the hardcore legend. Why was he given this moniker? Well, because throughout his career, he displayed an uncanny ability to push things to all new levels. It didn't matter if it was his run in WCW as Cactus Jack, where he and Vader just about murdered each other across a series of bouts, or his time spent under the same gimmick in ECW, where he fully lived up to the extreme name of that company. Every time Mick hit the ring back then, you could be assured you were going to see something crazy. And that's not even getting into the wildness of his time spent out in Japan, where in 1995 he became the IWA King of the Deathmatch, with this being what initially put his name on the map at all on a worldwide scale. That said, for as crazy as things got in other places, Foley's wildest hardcore moments arguably came in the WWF after he joined that promotion in the mid-90s. And this is because it was here that while working under the guise of Mankind, he'd give us two of the most extreme moments ever seen inside of a wrestling ring. The first of which came when he wrestled The Undertaker at King of the Ring 1998 inside of Hell in a Cell, and just about killed himself in the process. That's right, after taking a terrifying bump off the top of the cage, and then another straight through the roof, the match would start and Mick would spend the next 15 minutes or so continuing to put his body through insane punishment. And the thing is, that might not even be his most hardcore moment in the WWF. No, this might be the time he fought The Rock at the Royal Rumble in 1999, and in a scene which was largely seen as too much for even bloodthirsty Attitude Era audiences of the time, took a staggering 11 unprotected chair shots to the head. Needless to say then, it wouldn't be long after this before Mrs. Foley's baby boy decided to hang up his boots. And nothing of that level of gruesomeness would ever be allowed inside of a WWF ring again. But one place that level of savageness was still being allowed was over in Extreme Championship Wrestling, the same place our next subject made his name, the Sandman. Yes, the Sandman's vibe was very much that of a guy who just got off his job as a long-haul trucker and had gotten into a bar fight while pounding a few beers. And that's exactly what made him such a great hardcore brawler, as to watch him tussle with his coworkers over in Philly in such a scrappy manner was like watching someone take part in a real fight at times. As you can imagine then, this made him a big hit with the Philadelphia faithful, and it even led to him becoming world champion there on 5 separate occasions. Of course, it's not really those title reigns most people remember him for today, though. No, it's the wild hardcore moments he was part of. Moments like the time he was apparently blinded by someone we'll get to in a moment, causing him to have to feign retirement. And then there was the time he was quite literally crucified at the ringside area during ECW High Incident in October 1996, a crazy moment to say the least, and one which only went further towards establishing Paul Heyman's promotion as being an outlaw one where anything and everything could happen. Very few wrestlers would have put themselves in that situation, but the Sandman did, because he was just that hardcore. Yes, one of James Fullington's favorite things prior to a match was to walk out to enter Sandman while he pounded a few beers, meaning that by the time the bell had rung, he no doubt already had a bit of a buzz going on. Of course, the Sandman wasn't the only hardcore legend of ECW who's earned a spot in today's video, though. No, there were plenty of others who were eligible for that role too. And one of them is our next subject, the man who we alluded to a moment ago that once crucified the Sandman, the man known as Raven. That's right, we had to include Raven in this video because he was so synonymous with hardcore wrestling back during the turn of the millennium period. After all, throughout his run in ECW, he was a part of some of the most brutal moments that promotion was ever a part of. And if we're talking about feuds which defined Extreme Championship Wrestling, then his years-long odyssey with Tommy Dreamer has to be right at the top of the list, as it's one of the greatest feuds of all time. But it wasn't just his ECW run which made Raven such a hardcore legend, as he'd take his act to other places and make a name for himself there too. Yes, we're talking about his time in WCW, where he was revealed to be a spoiled rich kid, his time in TNA, where he's settled into more of a Legends role, or most prominently his time in WWF during the Attitude Era. Why was his run in WWF the most prominent of his non-ECW work? Well, because it was there he became a mainstay of the promotion's hardcore division, winning that belt a record 26 times before all was said and done, and even carrying it into WrestleMania 17, where he had an incredible three-way bout with The Big Show and Kane. That's right, Scott Levy was able to carve out a place for himself in WWF, and being able to carve out a place for himself wherever he goes is a skill he's continued to use right up until the present day, as while he might not be a full-time performer anymore, he's still been known to show up at a local indie here and there where he can remind everyone exactly what makes him so hardcore. Not bad for a man whose first notable character was that of backstage interviewer and manager Johnny Polo, and all he had to do in order to do so was to tap into that violent side of himself, the one which wanted to show the world just how dangerous he could be when given a chance. But what of that great career rival of his who we talked about a moment ago? Doesn't he deserve a mention in this video too, for both his feud with Raven and for everything else he did? Why, yes he does. So let's talk about him now then, the man who blinded the Sandman, a man so hardcore they called him the innovator of violence, Tommy Dreamer. Of course, Tommy Dreamer didn't start off this way though. No, believe it or not, during his early days as a wrestler, he was considered a little bit too much of a pretty boy to be taken seriously by the ECW audience. That would all change, however, when in 1994, he got into a feud with the Sandman, one which culminated in a Singapore cane match. What was the stipulation of this one? Well, it was that the loser would have to take 10 lashes to the back with a cane, and there's no way to fake that. So when Dreamer lost and took his lumps then, it earned him a whole lot of respect with the audience as they realized he really was a tough guy. And that would catapult him toward the level of being the spiritual face of the entire promotion. Yes, whenever Tommy Dreamer showed up to take part in one of Extreme Championship Wrestling's trademark wild brawls, he'd always have the fans behind him, whether he was chasing the ECW World title, protecting his wife Beulah McGillicuddy, or engaging in a lengthy program with Raven. That's right, in what was the original version of Cody Rhodes finishing the story, the multi-year-long arc of Tommy Dreamer trying to score a win over his greatest rival served as the backbone to ECW throughout the mid-90s. So when on Raven's last night with the company in 1997, Tommy finally got the better of him, it felt like a truly cathartic moment. But that wouldn't be the end of his career. No, he'd continue on for a while yet, even after ECW went under in early 2001, and he'd do that in places like WWE. Sure, the innovator of violence would never be as big a star in WWE as he had been prior, but he would carve out a nice role for himself in their hardcore division, with this allowing him to play to his strengths as a brawler. And after his time there came to an end, Tommy would move on to pastures new like TNA. Hell, he'd even start his own indie promotion at one point, House of Hardcore. So if we're talking about people who maintain that punk rock attitude when it comes to hardcore wrestling, Tommy Dreamer is most certainly one of them. But he's not the craziest person to ever come out of an ECW ring. No, that honor has to go to our next subject, New Jack. Okay, where do we start with New Jack? One of the wildest wrestlers to ever set foot inside of a ring. Yes, he was never going to give you a technical classic on the level of a Bryan Danielson or a Bret Hart, but what he was going to do was bring a sense of complete chaos to the proceedings whenever he showed up. Why was this? Well, because there was a real sense that anything could happen whenever he was there. After all, it was him who was responsible for the infamous mass transit incident in 1996 when he really hurt an untrained young wrestler. And it was him who was responsible for the bump Vic Grimes took off the scaffolding at an XPW show in 2002. Yes, some of the craziest moments in wrestling history can be attributed to New Jack, and this was exactly why he found it so hard to get booked after a while. Sure, Paul Heyman would always use him when he could, as there was such an aura of danger around the man, it never failed to draw in a crowd. But with certain states banning him from performing following the mass transit incident, the chances to use New Jack became more limited. Still, this only meant that when he did show up with a trolley full of weapons, it felt like a true event as he beat up everyone in the ring, all while the sounds of Ice Cube's natural-born killers blared out of the arena's loudspeakers throughout. That said, it did mean Heyman was never going to be able to do anything like put a world title on New Jack, and it also meant that when ECW went under in 2001, there was no way WWF was ever going to go anywhere near the North Carolinian. No, from the 2000s onwards, Jerome Young would have to settle for being a legend of the indie circuit, as he mostly showed up in local promotions here and there for a payday. Yes, it is true that he got a couple of shots in TNA, but these were never destined to be long-term. And even with the ECW nostalgia that WWE have leaned into in recent years, prior to his passing in 2021, they never brought in New Jack. Yes, they knew all too well what his reputation was and what he'd be liable to do if someone gave him a steel chair or a scaffolding to climb. No, it's probably for the best that New Jack stayed away from the big leagues during his final years, as it allowed his legend as the ultimate renegade to continue to grow. The legend of perhaps the most hardcore man the North American scene has ever seen or ever will see. Well, at least in the modern day anyway, because if we head back to the Territory era, we'll find someone else who might be able to challenge him for that role. Who are we talking about here? Why, Abdullah the Butcher, of course. That's right, Abby was one of the wildest performers of all time, and this gave him quite a reputation as someone to be feared. In fact, whenever he arrived in a territory, it was guaranteed to draw a large crowd of fearful onlookers as they settled in to watch what was going to be a car crash inside of a wrestling ring. That said, should things spill outside of the ring, those same fans wouldn't waste time in fleeing if the Butcher came too close to them. But then maybe that was a good idea, because given how much punishment he would inflict upon opponents such as Big Cat Ernie Ladd, The Sheik, and the legendary Jumbo Tsuruta whenever they locked up, and given how much he fully lived the character, never breaking kayfabe for anyone, there was a real fear associated with Abdullah the Butcher. The kind of fear you just couldn't replicate nowadays with how much the veil of secrecy behind the industry has been lifted. The closest thing we could compare it to would be if fans could be led to believe a real fighter like Brock Lesnar or Bobby Lashley really had gone rogue and was about to attack members of the audience. And that's not even getting into the forks, a favorite of Abby's and one that he would often use to carve his opponents' foreheads open. But then to be fair, he was only too happy to allow the same thing to happen to him when the time came. And that's exactly why he had those scars in his forehead which were so deep he could legitimately balance a coin in them. All of this is to say that back during the Territory days, there were few names which could inspire as much terror amongst fans as Abdullah the Butcher. But there was one other person who could approach that level of mayhem and create that much of a sense of terror whenever they arrived in front of a live crowd. Someone who did this in just about every continent in the world, wrestling's ultimate rebel, Bruiser Brody. That's right, Brody provided some of the greatest hardcore wrestling in existence, stuff so good it still holds up to this day. But then what else would you expect from a man who took absolutely no nonsense from anyone at this point in his life? No, if you think people like CM Punk, Steve Austin, and Roddy Piper were rebellious during their day, you haven't seen anything yet. How did he do this? Well, by doing exactly what he wanted whenever he wanted to. And if that meant he took a dislike to his opponent that night and didn't want to sell for them, then so be it. Lex Luger found this out during one infamous steel cage match the pair had in 1987, and that was why he famously fled the ring before things could turn into a real fight. That's right, it was well known back then that so hardcore was Bruiser Brody, he was the last person you ever wanted to upset. But even if he could be a headache in this respect, he was so over with audiences on account of his wild man style, he continued to be booked in just about every territory there was. And that would lead to him having classic matches against a who's who of opponents at the time. We're talking about names like Bruno Sammartino, Antonio Inoki, and Abdullah the Butcher, all while he was also teaming up with the likes of Big John Studd and Stan Hansen. Sadly though, living the life of an outlaw would end up coming back to bite Frank Goodish, as it was what led to his untimely passing in 1988. What happened here? Well, it was while working in Puerto Rico for Invader 1, someone who Brody had gone through issues with in the past, that a backstage argument would lead to him being attacked in the showers and passing away right there. Yes, it was one of wrestling's most infamous moments, and something which is still talked about to this day. Yes, we'd have loved for Bruiser Brody to have lived on to become an elder statesman of hardcore wrestling into the 90s and beyond. Maybe even showing up for places like WWE and WCW and helping to raise the next generation up. It certainly wouldn't be unheard of for this to happen, as the same thing would end up happening with our next subject, the one, the only, Terry Funk. Yes, Terry Funk is one of the greatest wrestlers of all time, easily a performer who could be on anyone's top 10 list when it comes to greats of the ring. But while many today would consider him a legend of hardcore wrestling, the godfather of the genre in many ways, he wasn't always this kind of fighter. No, back during his early years working on the territory circuit with his brother Dory Funk Jr., he had a reputation of being something of a technical maestro, a mat worker extraordinaire whose closest comparison today might be someone like a Chad Gable. Hell, so good was he at this part of his job, he was even able to become NWA World's Champion in 1975 when he beat Jack Briscoe for the honor. That said, as time went on and he saw the landscape of the industry changing, the Funkster was smart enough to know that he had to adapt, and that was what led him to join a then upstart promotion known as Eastern Championship Wrestling in 1993, and there tried to build up their company into something bigger. How would he do this? Well, by playing into their gimmick of going hardcore, something that got even worse when they transformed into Extreme Championship Wrestling soon thereafter. Luckily though, by this point, Terry was all too familiar with hardcore wrestling, as while out in Japan he'd made a name for himself with such a style, with him even taking part in that iconic King of the Deathmatch tournament, eventually won by Mick Foley. So despite by then being in his 40s, and old man in wrestling terms during that era, Funk was able to keep up with the rest of the roster and, in many ways, even exceed them as he completely transformed his character from technical wizard into that of a violent brawler who wasn't afraid to use any weapon given to him. And this all eventually led to him becoming ECW World Champion on 2 separate occasions. Of course, it wouldn't just be in ECW that he showed off this new hardcore style though. No, he also took his middle-aged and crazy gimmick over to both WCW and WWF, where he'd fit right in with the wild Crash TV stylings of the time. That's right, Terry Funk was awesome as a hardcore wrestler, arguably even better than he was a mat wrestler. And given how good he was at this, that's quite an achievement. But then when you're talking about Terry Funk, this level of range is to be expected, and it's part of what makes him such a legend. Hell, it would even allow him to last long enough to work for TNA briefly when he shared a locker room with our next subject, Abyss. That's right, it's time for us to venture back over to TNA, as it's there pretty much the entirety of Abyss's in-ring career played out. And that makes him one of the true pillars then, someone who remained with the promotion through thick and thin, like an Impact version of what The Undertaker was to WWE or what Sting was to WCW. It's not just that he was there for so long that made the DC native so popular with the TNA faithful though. No, it's also the fact that he was so willing to put his body on the line in some truly brutal hardcore matches. Really, even with all the former ECW talent who passed through the doors of Nashville over the years, there's probably no one more associated with being a hardcore performer there than Joseph Park. Hell, he even had a special match type made to satisfy his bloodlust, with that being the Monsters Ball match. What were the rules to this one? Well, they were basically that in kayfabe at least, everyone involved would be locked in a room without food or water for 24 hours before the bout took place, with this leaving them in a feral state and ready to commit unreasonable acts of violence once they hit the ring. Obviously then, Abyss took full advantage of these opportunities to cause chaos whenever they happened, with him often bringing out those trusty old tools of his like barbed wire and thumbtacks to help him get the job done. But then it wasn't just in Monsters Ball matches that he's shown. No, he was also known to get violent at other times too, even if it wasn't technically within the rules. Basically, as a visual mixture of both Kane and Mankind, he was carrying on the legacy of what those men were doing back during the late 90s in hardcore brawls, specifically Foley, who Abyss in many ways feels like a spiritual successor to. And this style of brawling and mayhem led to much title success for him during his lengthy run with TNA. In fact, between his debut in 2002 and his exit in 2019, he'd become a one-time world champion, one-time X Division champion, two-time television champion, three-time tag team champion, and a member of the 2018 Impact Hall of Fame class. Alas though, eventually all the punishment he'd put upon his body for all those years became too much for him to bear anymore, and so that was why he'd enter retirement as the 2020s dawned. Not that he'd leave the business entirely though. No, after signing on the dotted line with WWE in 2019 to take on a job as a behind-the-scenes agent, he'd be able to reunite with old friends like AJ Styles and Samoa Joe, all while even making the occasional on-screen cameo in backstage segments with the former. Two people he never got to share the screen with in WWE, however, are our next two subjects, as they were both gone by then. Who are we talking about this time? Who else but Hardcore and Crash, the Holly Cousins. Yes, we are doing a 2-for-1 with this entry because, try as we might, we just couldn't separate these two. But then how could we when their careers are so closely intertwined with one another? Sure, it wasn't always that way, as early on in Hardcore Holly's run, back when he went by names like Hollywood Bob Holly down in Smoky Mountain Wrestling or Thurman Sparky Plug over in New Generation era WWF, he was more of a solo act. But after leaning into the hardcore division as the late 90s came around and changing his name to Hardcore Holly, the Alabama native realized it was better to have some people there to back him up. So that's what eventually led to the introduction of his kayfabe cousin Crash in 1998. Who was Crash? Well, he was basically the scrappy dude Bob Holly's Scooby, what with him only being a small guy who, in his own mind's eyes, thought he was a heavyweight. And that would soon lead him into the hardcore division with his cousin, where he proved to be so successful he'd pretty much become synonymous with the WWF version of the hardcore title. That's right, despite his older cousin literally having the word hardcore in his name, and despite Bob finding a lot of success himself in that division, so much so that he'd become a 6-time hardcore champion in his own right, it will always be Crash Holly people think of first when they think of the hardcore title. And that's because back at the turn of the millennium, when it was being defended under 24/7 rules, meaning anyone could challenge for it at any place at any time as long as they had a referee with them, he was usually the one holding it. Needless to say then, this led to a lot of crazy scenes as he was forced to defend his gold in places like a hotel room or a children's jungle gym, all while barely escaping by the skin of his teeth. Hell, there were times he'd even have to fight hardcore Holly in spaces like these. But no matter how much they fought and no matter how hardcore things got between them at points, they always remained family and so always had each other's backs when it counted. And that's the important thing at the end of the day, something which was brought into sharp focus when Crash passed away all too young in November of 2003 at just 32 years old. But even if he is gone now, he, along with his cousin and everyone else we've looked at today, remain amongst the biggest legends of hardcore wrestling, and people who can proudly say they all played a role in taking things to the extreme in a way that few others around them ever could.